All right. Welcome back to the final session for today. My name is Cami Kepke, and I am a graduate student here at UC San Diego. And our last speaker for today is going to be Matthew Talbert, and he's going to be speaking on omission and attribution error. David Brink was going to be the responder. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolina said that we'd talked enough about unwitting omissions, so I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint her. What I have to say is related to and critical of the perspectives that Cher and Clark were arguing for, and similar to Heidi's criticisms, though I'll obviously go into a bit more detail. What I want to do is to talk about the consequences of accepting an attributionist perspective on moral responsibility. So there's this handout, which will hopefully be of some help. I've included a few lengthy quotations and some brief summaries of some of the arguments that I make. The first quotation is there from Scanlon. Questions about moral responsibility are most often questions about whether some action can be attributed to an agent in the way that is required in order for it to be a basis for moral appraisal. So we get the idea of attribution right there. In particular, what we tend to be interested in is the idea that the agent is morally appraisable for the action insofar as it evinces or expresses a morally significant aspect of her orientation toward other people. We might talk about the judgments that she's expressed through her actions or her attitudes and whether or not those are objectionable or in some way criticizable. So that tends to be what attributionists are concerned with, and it's certainly the way that I interpret the view. Attributionism typically, so the salient feature, the feature that a lot of critics have picked up on, is that attributionists tend to think that moral responsibility doesn't require control. There are states that could be attributable to you for the purposes of moral appraisal that you can be asked to defend or to withdraw, and that express an objectionable orientation that you have toward other people. Your desires, your beliefs, your attitudes may be like this. You may not have caused yourself to be the way you are. You may not be able to change the way you are, but our moral responsibility judgments on this view are primarily responses just to the way you are and don't necessarily make assumptions about how you came to be that way or whether or not you have control over your disposition to make certain judgments or to possess certain attitudes. This view needs to be distinguished from the view that Gary Watson calls the attributability face of moral responsibility and blame in two faces of responsibility. He distinguishes between attributionism or the attributability face and the accountability face. And some people have moved away from using the terminology attributionism because they worry, I think, that it evokes Gary Watson's distinction in an unhelpful and somewhat confusing way. The issue is that for Watson, the attributionists seem to have been primarily interested just with specifying the conditions on the attributability of actions to people and not with the justification of the accountability face of responsibility. So the picture that you get from reading that paper is that attributionists don't really care about resentment. They don't really care about holding responsible. They're just interested in this question of attributability. And that might be true of some views, and it might be true of the views that Watson had in mind, but it's not true of the views that are contemporarily called attributionist views. Those views, I take it, are really interested in the prospect of holding people accountable, of blaming in a robust sense. And what the view boils down to, in my view, is that there's a really low threshold on being open to those kinds of responses, and having your behavior attributable to you, having attitudes attributable to you is sufficient for you to be held accountable for having those attitudes or for having acted in that way. So if you want to put it in a slogan, you could say something like, attributability is enough for accountability. Satisfying the attributability conditions on responsibility is enough for you to be blamed in a very serious way. Some people have moved away, as I said, from the label attributionism. Angela Smith calls her view the rational relations view. I think that name makes sense, but you have to get a bit inside of her account to understand why that name makes sense. Neil Levy, an opponent of the view, now calls it the quality of will view. I think that's fine too. It may suggest a relationship with P.F. Strawson's view that's not entirely helpful. So I still like calling it attributionism. We can call it new attributionism if we want, if we're really worried about confusing it with the sort of stuff that Gary Watson was talking about. Now, the problem, so I said that I wanted to talk about the consequences of accepting this view. And there are two potentially problematic, probably more than that, but there are at least two problematic consequences potentially of accepting this view. One is with the sufficient conditions that the attributionist placed on blameworthy. They may seem too easy to fulfill. And this is the kind of criticism that the view has encountered most often. It holds people responsible, it blames people who ought to be excused. The people raised by Nazis who had no control over their upbringing and through no fault of they were never culpable, but now they've got these bad attitudes, these corrupt moral values. They act on them. How can you blame them for that? Well, the attributionist does, so maybe that's a problem. Blaming psychopaths, that's something that I've argued might be perfectly reasonable. A lot of people think that that's got to be a mistake, and insofar as attributionism seems to license that response to them, that's a mark against the view. What I want to talk about, though, in this paper is the necessary conditions on a responsibility according to the attributionist. Maybe it's maybe it's required that your behavior evinces an objectionable quality of will, or an objectionable, I tend to call it just an orientation, which is really vague, but to do the work of quality of will, judgment, attitude, it evinces an objectionable moral orientation toward other people. Maybe that's required for moral responsibility, and it may be that a lot of these cases, these unwitting omission cases, that necessary condition isn't fulfilled. So you got a lot of people, garden variety moral wrongdoers, garden variety instances of unwitting omission that don't satisfy necessary conditions on moral responsibility according to the attributionist view, but that's a problem for the view because it conflicts so obviously with our moral practices. We're not really skeptical about blaming people in these cases. So insofar as attributionism, as I'm articulating it, counsels skepticism, that's a mark against the view too. It's that criticism that I'm going to focus on in this paper. And I'll start with where is he? Randy Clark's the milk case. So he talked about that today. That was a version of the an example that's in his wonderful book Omissions. It's laid out there. I guess I'll read through it just for the sake of precision. As I'm about to leave my office at the end of the workday, my wife calls to tell me we're out of milk. My regular route home takes me right by a grocery store, and I tell her I'll stop and buy some. I've always assumed that he's driving. I realized yesterday he could have been walking, but I assume he's driving. Between my office and the store, I start to think about something else, omissions, ironically. I continue thinking about my work until I arrive home, where I realize that I've forgotten milk. Now, that obviously it's not a big deal, and one thing we could talk about is, will our intuitions change if we make it into a big deal? But it's not a big deal, but Clark thinks that still his wife has grounds for blame, to a small extent, but still genuine blame. Not just disappointment, not just aggravation at Randy's forgetfulness, but actual blame, not much of it, but genuine blame. We'll lack milk for breakfast, and the fault lies with me. I said I'd get it. I was easily to do so, and I didn't. Now, Clark says that he's blameworthy, because he acted freely, and what he means in this case is that his forgetting was an entirely prosaic instance of that kind of thing. He had the general capacities necessary. Nobody held a gun to his head. And he was also obliged to do it. He said he would do it. And in a really straightforward sense, he could have done it. And so he's blameworthy for not doing it. And I take it that's the whole story pretty much for the blameworthiness on Clark's view. Now, I agree with Clark that tracing is not necessary here. Clark doesn't have to be condemnable for failing to do something else in order to be blameworthy for forgetting the milk. I agree that if he were blameworthy, his blameworthiness would not have to hinge on him having done something else that he was independently criticizable for. That's not to say that there's nothing he could have done that would have prevented him from getting the milk. He could have taken a sticky note and written milk on it in capital letters and put that on the steering wheel. He could have made a concerted effort to not let anything enter his mind as he was driving, but just mentally say milk, milk, milk. He could have done those things. Had he done those, he probably wouldn't have forgotten, but he's not obliged to do those kinds of things. So he didn't do some things that he could have done, and if he had done those things, he wouldn't have forgotten, but the things that he didn't do, he wasn't obliged to do. So his present blameworthiness, if it obtains, doesn't have to trace back to something that he did earlier. And I also agree with Clark that if we did think that that was the case, if we did want to rely on tracing in these examples, then there would be a lot less blameworthiness than we ordinarily suppose. I think a lot of, as I say, garden variety wrongdoers, garden variety unwitting wrongdoers don't fulfill the relevant tracing conditions. And Clark says, so it's a virtue of my view, virtue of his view, that he can explain why those people are blameworthy. His account, he says, doesn't conflict with our practices, and practices, I forget exactly how he puts it, but something like is wiser than theory in many cases. Where I disagree with Clark is that I take him, and this really became apparent earlier, that he doesn't think that a condemnable lack of concern for his wife's interests has to be causally relevant to his forgetting. That's my fundamental disagreement with him. I'm not sure if I have this quotation. No, I don't. So he says, we may suppose, so in going through this list of things that he might have done in order to prevent his forgetting, he says, and we may suppose that blameworthiness for my omission to get milk can't be traced to blameworthiness for prior actions or omissions that led to my caring little for my wife's interests. I don't have that shortcoming. I take it when he says I don't have that shortcoming, he means not only did he not cause himself to have too little concern, he actually does not have too little concern. And that is not a requirement on his blameworthiness. It just is immaterial. All that's required is the satisfaction of the control condition and the presence of the obligation. He could have done it, he should have done it. He's blameworthy since he didn't. I disagree. I think moralized blaming responses, genuine, what I'll call genuine moral blame, resentment involving moral blame, requires a moral affront. And while Clark's forgetting the milk is unwelcome, it's unhappy, he'd change it if he could, it's disappointing, it's not in itself a moral affront. What would be necessary to make it expressive of a moral affront is that it was independently, it was related to some sort of independently objectionable attitude or judgment on Clark's part. I mean, that is, when I say independently objectionable, I mean objectionable for some reason beyond the fact that it caused him to forget. Now, this is going to bring me into conflict with our moral practices again, because I take it we're not really skeptical, or a lot of us aren't skeptical about Clark's blameworthiness in this case. I take it that's a pretty common sense view that he would be blameworthy. So at the end of the paper, I'll try to not explain that away, but say something about that conflict that's helpful. Clark grants that there can be excuses in his case. He says that he's not excused, so in the book he says he's not excused in the original version of the example because, quote, no extraordinary circumstance, no horrifying car crash, no exploding bomb, no apocalyptic news story on the radio that might have taxed his ability to recall mundane plans occurred. None of those things occurred. I take him to be suggesting that if they had occurred, then he wouldn't be blameworthy, he would be excused in those cases. But why would those count as excuses? Why would these extraordinary circumstances count as excuses? And what I want to say, well, so let's assume that one of those extraordinary circumstances did occur. Let's suppose that he narrowly avoids a collision. Maybe a truck runs a red light, almost hits him, but by the grace of God, it doesn't. He makes his way home. I suggest that if we're inclined to regard Clark as an inapt candidate for blame in that modified example, it's because his forgetting is now readily explicable in terms of this near miss that he had. The availability of that explanation, why it does the excusing work, is because it undermines an assumption that would otherwise seem very natural, namely that Clark forgot about the milk because he didn't care as much about it as he ought to have, and by extension that he didn't care as much about satisfying his wife's desire for the milk as he ought to have. So he would be excused in this case, the extraordinary circumstance case. But it seems to me the reason that that is so is because the presence of the extraordinary circumstance gives us something really easy in virtue of which to explain his forgetting. And in virtue of explaining the forgetting that way, we're not inclined to explain it in another way, namely a way that would reflect poorly on Clark. And note in particular that if that was not the case, that is, if the explanation, this new possible explanation, the near miss, didn't help us see that he didn't have these condemnable attitudes, if that weren't the case, then we wouldn't be inclined to excuse him. That is, if we knew about the near miss, and yet we still believed, maybe had good reason to believe, that he does have condemnable attitudes towards his wife, we wouldn't take the near miss as an excuse. Now, one could argue that the real reason the near miss excuses is because it makes it unreasonably difficult for him to remember his plans to get the milk. I think that's a kind of tempting thing to say. Why does the near miss excuse? Well, how could you expect somebody to do it in that case? It's too much to ask. But I think that reference to difficulty in these cases is, again, just a way of showing us that the behavior wasn't expressive of the agent's moral orientation. It was difficult for her to act otherwise. Therefore, you shouldn't take what she did as expressive of who she really is, or however you want to put it. It doesn't express her committed judgments and moral attitudes. I think excuses based on compulsion and coercion and other kinds of examples in which we might reference the idea that, well, it was difficult for the coerced agent to do something else. It was difficult for the compulsive agent to do otherwise. Again, what those do is the excusing work in those cases is done by the fact that the actions now don't represent the agent's commitments in the way that they otherwise might. Obviously, compulsion and coercion are different, but I think something similar goes on in both examples. The compulsive agent's behavior is explained by the fact that she was subject to this compulsive urge, not necessarily because she judged that this action was choice-worthy. The coerced agent may judge that the action in question is choice-worthy, but given the coercive pressures that she's been exposed to, that judgment doesn't make attributable to her the attitudes that otherwise might be attributable to her. The coerced agent may have had good reason to act as she did. So let's suppose, so far the argument is something like this. There are some excusing factors that Clark acknowledges in this case. If those factors are obtained, he would be excused, and I want to say, well, the reason he would be excused is because those provide us with another way of explaining his behavior, one that doesn't reflect poorly on him in the way that would be sufficient for and necessary for blameworthiness. I think we should also consider the possibility that even if there were no obvious excusing conditions, it's still possible that Clark didn't have the kinds of attitudes that's necessary for blameworthiness. Excusing conditions, the extraordinary circumstances, give us evidence that he doesn't have those attitudes. Now we don't have to explain his behavior in that way. But it seems perfectly possible that even if there hadn't been any extraordinary circumstances, his behavior still isn't best explained in terms of his objectionable judgments or objectionable attitudes. So that gives us some reason to be skeptical in these cases, even if we're not certain that he has access to an excuse, as we would be in this case where he can tell us about the dramatic near miss. Even if we're not certain, it's still at least possible. And so a question might be, well, how ought we to weigh that possibility in our judgments about blameworthiness and our inclinations toward blaming responses? Then I think there's a good chance we ought to be fairly skeptical about it, that a lot of these garden variety cases might be like this. They're not best explained by attributing condemnable attitudes or judgments to the forgetful agent. Imagine a case in which there's no obvious excusing factor, none of these extraordinary circumstances obtain, and Clark's wife agrees that, and she knows that his forgetting doesn't tell her anything morally relevant about his orientation toward her. It's not related to some independently condemnable feature of Clark's judgments. Now, in that case, if Clark's wife went ahead and blamed him, I would think she has to be making some kind of mistake. I'd have trouble making sense of the scenario, in fact. I would think that she's not admitting it, but she must be attributing to him some sort of objectionable attitude over and above the fact that he forgot. She must be explaining it in terms of something else in order for it to elicit resentment, for instance. So I think that if Clark's not deficient in his concerns for his wife for getting the milk, then we ought to excuse him even if there aren't any extraordinary circumstances that obviously provide him with an excuse. So that's what I want to say about Clark's case. Now, a similar case from Angela Smith. And this is a well-known case from her paper Responsibility for Attitudes, where she does a lot of work laying out the fundamentals of this attributionist view. So the first quotation on the handout under 3 is this sort of distillation of the attributionist perspective. If one judges something or person to be important or significant, this should rationally have an influence on one's tendency to notice factors which pertain to the existence, welfare, or flourishing of that thing or person. If this is so, then the fact that a person fails to take note of such factors in certain circumstances, this is at least some indication that she does not accept this evaluation. So if you care about something, then you'll notice things that impinge on the welfare of this thing that you care about. And if you don't notice those things, that gives us, as she says, some indication that you don't care, that you don't make the relevant judgment that this thing is important. Note that she says only some indication, and then there's a footnote where she kind of spells that out. And she says roughly what Clark does. She says, well, in some cases, there could be these extraordinary circumstances, and that would sever the inference that we might normally make from what a person notices or forgets and what she cares about. I think that we need to take that caveat seriously, and maybe more seriously than Angela Smith does. I think we need to recognize again that inference between what a person notices and what she cares about, or what she doesn't notice and what she cares about, can be severed even in cases where we can't point to the thing that makes it obvious that that inference is severed, and that we should be live to that possibility when we're forming our responsibility judgments. So to illustrate why, or an instance in which I think this case, that caveat ought to be taken seriously, let's look at this other case of Angela Smith's, the one that she starts that paper with, and that's been cited a lot. And as far as I know, nobody's given it this interpretation. Most people just read it the way I take it that she meant for it to be read, a case of pretty straightforward blameworthiness. She says, I forgot a close friend's birthday last year. A few days after the fact, I realized that this important date had come and gone without so much as sending a card or giving a call. I was mortified. What kind of friend could forget such a thing? Within minutes, I was on the phone acknowledging my fault and offering apologies. I didn't intend to hurt my friend's feeling or even foresee that my conduct would have this effect. I just forgot. It didn't occur to me. I failed to notice. And yet, despite the apparent involuntariness of this failure, there was no doubt in either of our minds that I was indeed responsible for it. My friend was quick to pardon my thoughtlessness and to dismiss it, but the very act of pardoning itself is just a way of renouncing certain responses that would be appropriate. Now, I'm going to skip a section on tracing here, but I'll just note that Clark, Smith, and myself all agree that her forgetting here, in order for her to be blameworthy, doesn't need to be traceable to some other omission, some other culpable omission or action that she made. On a natural reading of this case, it seems to me that Smith maybe isn't, perhaps probably isn't open to blame for forgetting her friend's birthday, because her forgetting doesn't reveal anything morally significant about how Smith values her friend or their relationship. I get the sense from reading it, in fact, that she cares a lot about her friend. Quite plausibly, she cares as much as one ought to care about her friend. But if that's so, then by Smith's own account, the case isn't going to be one in which genuine, serious moral criticism or blame is appropriate. Smith obviously didn't care enough to remember the birthday, but that can't be the standard for how much one ought to care. After all, if some extraordinary circumstance had intervened, as Smith herself acknowledges, then Smith's concern for her friend wouldn't have been sufficient to keep her from forgetting the birthday, but it wouldn't follow that she didn't care as much as she ought to have. So not caring enough clearly isn't the standard for blameworthiness. No one thinks that, I take it, because everybody admits that there can be excusing conditions. Thus, the fact that Smith possesses a degree of concern that is insufficient to ensure that she remembers the birthday doesn't entail that her degree of concern is objectionably low. Now, in response, one might argue that Smith ought to care for her friend to such a degree, maybe this is the specification of ought, you ought to care for your friend to such a degree that in ordinary circumstances, you surely won't forget the birthday. But that again to me seems too strong. It seems to me obviously mistaken. I take the assumption behind that claim to be the claim that in normal circumstances, forgetting about anything extraordinary, you ought to care enough such that it's ensured that you'll remember. I think that that's pretty clearly mistaken, because it seems that in normal circumstances, people forget or fail to notice stuff that they actually do care a lot about. And maybe, I want to say that they care about it as much as they ought to have, the case that we've been talking about today, the parents who leave the children in the back seat. When you read the accounts that these people give, at least in many of the cases, I don't walk away with the sense that their parental concern is deficient. I mean, obviously it wasn't enough in this case to get them to remember, but I don't feel as if they care too little for their children. They care very much for their children, they just happen to forget. And that's simply something that happens to us, and we shouldn't be as ready as we are to attribute questionable values, attitudes, and judgments to people on the basis of their forgetting. So, what do we make then of Smith's apologizing to her friend and her friend pardoning her? If we think that apology presumes blameworthiness, which is a pretty plausible view, then do I have to say that her apologies are insincere or inapt in this case? So Smith forgets the birthday and she apologizes. I don't want to say that that has to be insincere or inapt. It seems entirely apt. What I would say, though, is that there are forms of apology that don't presume the kind of blameworthiness that I have in mind. In particular, Smith's apology need not have presumed her own blameworthiness, because, in the sense that I'm thinking of blameworthiness, because it need not have presumed the attribution of objectionable qualities or objectionable judgments to Smith. Smith doesn't have to be thinking of herself that way when she apologizes. In other words, Smith's apology may not have been meant to express a thought like, I'm sorry that my degree of concern for you was objectionably low. I could imagine that being the case and somebody actually offering that apology, though you'd wonder, well, why would you actually apologize if your concern is objectionably low? But I take it that that's not what's happening when she's apologizing. It seems more likely that the apology is an effort to assure Smith's friend that despite how things appear, the degree of concern wasn't objectionably low. So Smith's apology doesn't say, I'm sorry that I don't care about you, or I'm sorry that I didn't care about you, but something like, please accept that I do care even though my actions didn't indicate it, or even though you seem to have evidence to the contrary. Such an apology is not a way of accepting responsibility for a moral fault so much as an effort to provide an excuse. So I feel like this is a familiar form of apology, but it's a bit different from the way that we normally think of apology. It's an effort to provide an excuse, an effort to convince the one to whom the apology is offered, or you can put apology in scare quotes if you like, that the crucial moral fault that otherwise would require apology, in fact, didn't occur. And if Smith's friend accepts the apology on those terms, then she's not overlooking an objectionable evaluative judgment, but is rather accepting that the appearance of that judgment is misleading. In this case, the friend's pardon isn't going to be a step along the way to repairing a relationship. It's rather going to be a way of acknowledging that the relationship was only apparently impaired. On the other hand, if Smith didn't apologize, this might itself be taken to suggest that she doesn't care as much as she ought to about her friend's feelings or for their relationship. So the aim of Smith's apology in a case like this, I would say, is not just to testify to her past concern, to assure the friend that her past concern was what it ought to have been, even though it wasn't sufficient to ensure her forgetting, but also to manifest that concern in the present through an expression of regret that the friend's feelings were hurt. I take the desire on the part of an injured party for such an expression of regret to be a pretty familiar phenomenon. If I have a friend who inconveniences me, suppose we're trying to get to the airport to make a flight, or we have dinner reservations or something like that, and he's nowhere to be found, I'm going to be anxious, and I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to begin to resent him. I'm going to think that his tardiness is explained by the fact that he's not forming appropriate evaluative judgments. He doesn't care about this stuff as much as he ought to. Now, if my friend shows up with an excellent excuse, maybe he was in a car accident or something, well, that's a bit too strong. Let's say an excellent excuse, a traffic jam. I might now think there's no question of you taking responsibility of this. There's no question of you being blameworthy for inconveniencing me. But I would still find it odd if he didn't begin the conversation by apologizing. I still would expect him to acknowledge regret that I've been inconvenienced, even if he can't take responsibility for that regret. And if he didn't, I would think that that would be an independent sign that he had the kind of objectionable attitudes that might ground blame. Now, on the other hand, there can be cases, that's why I dismissed the accident case. I mean, if he were in an accident and he's in a coma in the hospital, I would be misevaluating things if I insisted that he take into account my inconvenience. But in other cases, we really do expect that. We expect an expression of regret. Maybe it's agent regret or related phenomenon, certainly, even in cases in which we don't think there's any question of blameworthiness. And that doesn't make the apologies insincere or inapt. It's just a specific kind of apology. Now, sometimes people really are open to blame for unwitting omissions, because sometimes omissions really do stem from and reflect a person's objectionable evaluative orientation towards others. And sometimes we have evidence for this, or at least some evidence for this. Imagine this sort of scenario. Clark's wife asks him to stop on his way home to pick up coffee and milk for tomorrow's breakfast. And Clark is a big fan of coffee, but he's lactose intolerant. The milk is for his wife. Clark remembers to stop at the store, and he remembers the coffee, but he forgets the milk. Now, maybe there we could say, yeah, maybe that's some evidence that he's not forming the evaluations that his wife would prefer him to, that he doesn't have the kind of concern he ought to. But I think a lot of cases probably aren't like that. Quite often, we probably shouldn't have much confidence that another person's forgetfulness or failures to notice something convey much that's morally relevant about what she values and who and how she is as a moral agent. But if that's so, then attributionists ought to have a healthy degree of skepticism about blameworthiness in these cases. Now, of course, I don't think that we generally do have a healthy degree of skepticism about these cases. A number of people in this room may, but I think the person on the street doesn't necessarily have that perspective. So what can I say about the result of this argument conflicting with our practices? And I think I can say something that at least makes it a little clear why we might not find this conflict surprising. And I'd start with George Scher's suggestion that our disposition toward blaming, and this is in praise of blame, our disposition toward blaming responses is partly explained by the fact that a wrongdoer has frustrated our desires. Our desire to not be wrong, the desire that he not be a wrongdoer or have a bad character. And that sounds right to me. It does seem that my disposition to blame is in part, is tied up with this frustration and disappointment that I've suffered. The cases of unwitting omission that we've been talking about also involve frustrated desires, insofar as we implicitly and generally want that harmful and unwelcome circumstances not occur. Now, the frustrated desire in these cases isn't, on my own account, is not wrongdoing. I think there's an important sense in which these people are not wrongdoers. And the sense in which they are wrongdoers is a fairly deflated sense. That's because I think wrongdoing in the robust sense involves ill will, bad judgments, and so forth, so there's this tight fit between wrongdoing in that narrow sense and blameworthiness. But in these cases, there's no question of the desire that you not be wronged having been frustrated. What I think is happening, though, is that when something unwelcome occurs, it's easy to regard that as the result of wrongdoing, since that gives you a valid outlet for your frustrations in the form of righteous anger. And that's something that we enjoy. It's additionally frustrating to simply have to deal with the way things have turned out. It's nice when you can get rid of some of that energy in what you take to be a morally valid way by feeling resentment and indignation. So my suggestion is that we probably tend to too easily attribute wrongdoing and thus blameworthiness to others. So we do make a mistake often, on my account, in being so ready to blame. But perhaps that mistake is psychologically understandable. I think that it's likely that we're primed to recognize instances in which others have been treated, in which we've been treated with improper regard. Recognizing when you've been disrespected is very important and valuable for social animals such as ourselves. So it wouldn't be surprising that we had an itchy trigger finger with respect to this, that it's so useful and we're so good at it, recognizing disrespect, that sometimes we have those responses and we take it to be present even when it's not. It might be a sort of analog with pareidolia, which is the phenomenon that you see Jesus' face in burnt toast or something like that. It's evolutionarily adaptive. I mean, I don't know much about this, but the story is it's adaptive to be able to recognize faces. So we need to be good at it. It's going to be bad for you if you're not good at it. But when you're as good at it as we are, you tend to do it even when you ought not be doing it. Maybe something similar happens with the attributions that arouse resentment and blame in us. So we might be so attuned to the possibility of disrespect that we tend to make that attribution even when it's not accurate. And the cases of unwitting omission that we've been talking about are ideal situations for that kind of misattribution because they involve harm or some unwelcome consequence. And harms are often the result of disregard or disrespect. And in this case, the genesis of the harm is unclear or ambiguous. So we've got to decide in an unreflective way whether or not this harm was the result of disrespect or not. And I'm suggesting that maybe it's really easy for us to fall on the disrespect side, to attribute that, and then we're blaming. So it may be that in these cases we naturally tend to reach for an erroneous explanation that casts the apparent cause of our harm in a morally worse light, at least in those cases in which there's not good evidence that the morally worse explanation is the incorrect one. The explanation isn't morally worse, but it's an explanation that casts the person as morally worse. And if I'm right about that, then it shouldn't be surprising that people often blame in error in cases of unwitting omission. They blame in error because they attribute the sort of orientation that would ground blame if the attribution were accurate, and they do this because of a built-in psychological tendency towards this kind of attribution error. And I'm not just entirely making this up out of whole cloth, because there's this huge body of literature on attribution error in social psychology. The most famous one is the fundamental attribution error. The idea there is that we interpret people's behavior in terms of inner states and their dispositions and motives and character traits, rather than attending to the situational factors that are in fact, or at least it's more likely the case that those situational factors are playing a role in bringing out the behavior. And there are other kinds of attribution errors. So what I'm thinking is that what I'm talking about is a version of the fundamental attribution error. And in fact, when you talk to psychologists about the attribution error, when you read about it, they often go immediately to examples in which what has been attributed is vice or a bad attitude or an objectionable judgment. That's not the only instance of fundamental attribution error, but it doesn't make a nice example for people who talk about it. So, for example, I was talking to a colleague at my university in the psychology department, and he told me this story about a patient who had anger control problems. And one day the patient's car was almost hit by another vehicle, and when the driver of the other cars ran through a red light. And the patient immediately thought of all kinds of dispositional factors, and they were all negative. You know, he's a jerk, he doesn't really care about other people, he doesn't know how to drive. And that stereotypically elicited blaming responses. Now, that is not a feature of the patient's anger control issues, right? I take it we all recognize ourselves in that patient so far. It's certainly what I do when somebody does something bad in traffic, and I immediately attribute all this stuff to that person. So that's not the anger control issue. The anger control issue is that the patient followed the guy, followed him for miles, and was gonna have an altercation with him until he followed him to the emergency room, and the driver of the car gets out with a bloody child and rushes the child inside. And now that the patient had another way of explaining the behavior, all the blaming attitudes just dissipated. So I think that's a helpful example, and I'll stop with that. I'm ahead of time.